Okay, good morning, Ambassador.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for allowing us this interview. Could you tell us your name and your rank and what you do now?
Well, I'm a civilian now. My name is Rich Armitage. I had been a naval officer. I served in the Department of Defense for 8 years as an Assistant Secretary of Defense, and most recently I've been the Deputy Secretary of State. I now run my own business here.
Oh, wow, that's great. We hear that you came to Vietnam twice during the 1975. Could you tell us about your 2 trips over there, and what was your mission over there?
Well, at the end of 1974, I returned home to my home in San Diego, and I was contacted by the Department of Defense. They asked me to return in early 1975 to take a look at the situation in Vietnam, and I did, and came back and reported to the department that it was a very deteriorating situation, and that it looked to me as if the pressure from the communists would be too much to withstand. I delivered my report, and I went home to San Diego, and I got another call from the Department of Defense on about the 21st or so of April. They asked me, was I willing to return to Vietnam to organize, initially, an operation to destroy very important military equipment, to deny the communists possession of it, and I agreed to do so. So I arrived back in Saigon on the 24th of April, 1975.
Okay, you said deteriorating situation in Vietnam. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I had, in March, the pressure on Da Nang was quite heavy. The communists were pushing down through Ba My Thuc. And it looked to me like it'd be very difficult to find a defensive line behind which we could muster and stop the communists. I didn't know how long it might take, but I thought that the ultimate demise of the country was going to be relatively soon.
Okay, and your mission?
My mission, when I went back the second time, it was to initially find a method to deny the enemy the use of important military equipment. Ships, airplanes, equipment that was stationed or stored at Bien Hoa Air Base. I was to destroy it, to keep it from falling into the hands of the communists.
Okay, and could you tell us how you plan to destroy those? Or?
Well, the equipment in Bien Hoa? Initially, I went to Bien Hoa on the 28th, early in the morning, and found the air base deserted. For the most part. I went in by helicopter. And I landed with a couple of other Americans, and we started initially to gather the equipment near a warehouse. And originally I was hoping to have a C-130 aircraft come in to take out this equipment. And if that was not possible, I was going to blow it up. The air base was became during the day under a lot of attack, a very heavy attack. From artillery, but when this started, Vietnamese soldiers who had been left behind, South Vietnamese soldiers, started to show up when they saw an American, and they started to help us, to defend us, while we went about the business of destroying this equipment. My boss, who was in Saigon, called me on a military radio and said, we're going to send a helicopter for you to get you out because we have intercepted enemy communications. They say they've found you in the base, they want to kill you. I told my boss, don't send a helicopter, because I have now about 30 South Vietnamese soldiers with me. And if I try to get out and leave them behind, they'll shoot me. So he swore. He was very angry. And he called back a little later, again on a tactical radio, and said, okay, we have a CIA aircraft who will come in and pick you and your Vietnamese soldiers up. And around 5 o'clock in the evening, after being there all day under artillery attack, CIA aircraft came in and picked me, the other 2 Americans, and about 30 Vietnamese soldiers. And as we circled up over Bien Hoa, you look down and could see the North Vietnamese run across the base. We went back to Saigon, landed at Ton Son Nhut, and immediately came under a bombing attack from the 4 A-37 aircraft, which had been captured in, I think, March, at Phan Thiet or Phan Rang, somewhere like that. and they bombed the air base. That was a sign to us that we had to accelerate our plan to evacuate or to destroy the naval ships, which I'd been talking about with Captain Do Kim. And he and I made a plan to not tell our Vietnamese families or Vietnamese sailors what we were going to do, but just have them gather on the ships in Saigon and other places, and then we'd all sail out together in a convoy to Con Son Island, and that's what happened.
Okay, so was the plan before to evacuate the officers and their family?
No, the plan from the U.S. point of view was to destroy the equipment. When I went to talk to Captain Kim about it, he was the operations chief for the Vietnamese Navy. He said, I can't, we've got, if I sail the ships out, these sailors won't want to leave their families. Will you make arrangements for them? And I knew that my government had not made any arrangements like this. And so I said nothing, but I understood what he meant. And I came back to him and said, just have the ships meet at Con Son Island and I'll take care of everything. So late on the 29th, I flew out of Saigon and landed on the USS Blue Ridge. I had no passport, I had no wallet, I had nothing except a gun, a .45. But when I saw an American officer, I stopped him and said, you won't believe this, but I'm on a mission from the Secretary of Defense and you have to let me talk to the Admiral. I'm a former naval officer and a Naval Academy graduate, and I know the Admiral because he played football at the Naval Academy, and so did I. This officer was very surprised, but he went to see the Admiral, and he said, there's a fellow here who claims he knows you, and he's on a mission from the Secretary of Defense. So I went to the Admiral and said, told him who I was and that I requested that he send an emergency message back to the Pentagon to find out who I was and what I was doing, because I could tell him, but why would he believe me? But he did. He was smart enough to send an immediate message back to Secretary of Defense Schlesinger, and who sent a flash answer back in about 20 minutes that told Admiral Whitmire, he is who he says he is, do what he says. So the Admiral said, well, what am I supposed to do? And I said, I need you to give me an American ship or two to go down to Con Son, because I have an unknown number of Vietnamese sailors and their family and civilians on an unknown number of Vietnamese ships. And so he sent me over to the USS Kirk, and I went aboard in the middle of the night, and there was a Commodore there along with the ship's captain. And he said to me, young man, I was much younger then, young man, I'm not used to having armed civilians come aboard my ship in the middle of the night. I said, Commodore, I'm not used to coming aboard ships armed in the middle of the night, but we've got a job to do. And then told him what my instructions were. We went to Con Son, and then we all together sailed across to Subic Bay in the Philippines. And my government was quite angry.
Because that was your plan.
That was my plan. It wasn't their plan.
The officers.
And no, not the officers and the men. So as many sailors as we could.
Okay, and how many people did you see, and how many ships did you?
Well, there's some dispute because, as you may remember from coming across, we actually sunk one of the ships on the way across. It was sinking, and so we evacuated, took the people off, put them on other very crowded ships, and used the ship which was sinking for target practice. And the Americans sank it at sea. So there were between 28 and 31 ships in total. And the estimates are between 28 to 30,000 people.
The people that you see, were they men, children, women?
Men, women, children, pregnant women. We had a woman who gave birth to a daughter on board the USS Kirk, and one of her names is Kirk. Her middle name is Kirk. So you saw everything. There were wounded people. There was everything.
Okay. Is there any situation that is stand out in your mind?
Yes. There's a bad situation. Well, there are two. The first was we were having people transfer from one ship to another. And the sea was a little rough. And we had a young man who panicked. And he rushed across the gangway between the two ships and pushed a little girl into between the two ships. And she died immediately. And one of the naval personnel on the ship shot this man. So he too went down. And that got rid of the panic. So that was a very unfortunate development. The second was as we were sailing across to the Philippines, I asked that all people who had weapons come to the back of the ship, what we call the fantail of the ship, and put their weapons down. And there were huge piles of weapons. So we couldn't go into Subic Bay. The Philippines wouldn't allow us, and they're armed. And I was astonished that this many weapons were carried aboard the ships. And there was one other incident. You may remember, on the way across, after the fall of Saigon, on the 30th, some Russian Bear bombers overflew us. And they flew very low, where we could even see the pilot and the co-pilot and others in the window of their cockpits. And they were just checking us out. We didn't know what they were going to do. But we had some ability, but a very limited ability to defend ourselves against them, because the Vietnamese ships were so crowded we couldn't fight there because it would hurt too many of our people. The American ships who were with us could have, but if the Soviet bombers had had a hostile intention, it would have been very difficult for us to do anything. And the last big memory I have is of sailing into Subic Bay. President Marcos, then president of...
You were in OC in the Glass Cathedral.
I was what?
April? Were you at the Glass Cathedral last April?
At that reunion?
Yes.
No, I didn't. The U.S. Kirk reunion, are you talking?
Yes.
No, I was invited. I've been to one. Oh, from which ship?
USS? No, not USS Kirk, was it?
They have one of the last one, and last April they handed out to us, and we give it to one of the Navy officers. They have one of the black in one of the ships. I think, like you said, there are several ships.
There were 20 or 30, 28 or 30. There was a bunch of them. Yes. But I've got them. The HQ-3 was the flagship of the Vietnamese Navy. Okay. And I went aboard that ship.
With the mission in Vietnam, were you satisfied?
No. If Captain Kim and I had had our way, and that we'd had 3 or 4 more days, we would have had not 30,000 people saved. We'd have had, I'm sure, well over 100,000.
But was the secret to move the people out?
Yeah.
A secret? Or
secret from the U.S. government? Yes.
The U.S. and from the Vietnamese?
Yes. That's why I said the plan was to send a message that Captain Kim and I talked about to all the different bases, whether it's in Vinh Binh or Vinh Long or Cà Mau or whatever, and say, for security reasons, please bring all families onto the base. And then we would, unknown to them, at some particular time, we would give an order for them to get on their small boats. If you're familiar with the Vietnamese Navy, they have small boats too. Sail down the river with families and we would pick them up at the mouth of the river. Because it would take some time for the communists to make it all the way down to Cà Mau and Rac Soi and Rac Nha. But we ran out of time. The communists moved more quickly than we thought. Yeah, I regret that we didn't have the time to carry that out. But I must say, I've been personally very satisfied that when you, for the 20 or so years after the fall of Saigon and still now, if you go to our high schools and look at our valedictorians and salutatorians, you recognize Vietnamese names, and it makes me quite proud. But I had an even greater experience as Deputy Secretary of State. I went to Iraq 7 or 8 times, and each time I'd go to Iraq, I would have official meetings with the Iraqi authorities, and I would go out and see our soldiers who were fighting. And I went to visit one battalion. And the battalion commander came out to see me. And he saluted me, and I looked at his name tag. And I said, "You're Vietnamese?" And he said, "Yes, sir." And he was the battalion commander in the U.S. Army. I was very proud.
Visit him?
Có. Tôi có thể, tôi nói còn giỏi hơn ông đó. Chắc chắn là tôi đọc nhiều hơn. Nhưng mà theo tôi nghĩ là tôi nói là giỏi hơn. But he was a battalion commander. Isn't that great?
He's a full colonel now.
Pardon me?
He's a full colonel.
Oh, yeah. He was a lieutenant colonel then.
And
Yeah.
what is it? He just went through Stanford for a PhD.
And in the U.S. Navy. One of the U.S. Navy ships that pulled into Cam Ranh Bay, had a commander. Vâng ạ.
You talked about this secret to evacuate.
Yes.
The officers
And men.
and men.
And their families, if we could.
Right, right. And because of this secret, that would not spread out many people, end up in concentration camp or a lot of
No,
people.
we, Captain Kim and I did this, just the two of us, and we told nobody. The reason we told nobody is because you didn't know what we were really going to do. We couldn't allow the communists to know our plans because they would ambush us on the river coming down from Saigon. So we had to keep this completely secret. And at a given time on the night of the 29th, the afternoon of the 29th, the order was given to the Vietnamese sailors and their officers to return to their ships. If they had family members, bring them. And that's what happened. And we sailed down. But if we'd have told this plan ahead of time, the communists would have set ambushes all the way down the Saigon River.
You ran out of.
You've stopped filming for a minute, have you?
With many people that were sent to concentration camps
Yes.
after what was your feeling when you know that because of the secrets of not moving out, those people that they ended up in
I think there's a misunderstanding. You're under the impression that this was only a secret from the Vietnamese. It was a secret from the U.S. government as well. The U.S. government wanted me to destroy equipment and ships so the communists couldn't get them. The U.S. government did not necessarily want to have 30,000 more Vietnamese. They were already coping with a lot of people who'd come out by helicopter and whatnot, some of whom I actually arranged before the 30th to come out, especially through some special flights in Tan Son Nhut. So the U.S. government had a large refugee problem on their hands already. To have an additional 30,000 people all at once was a real problem for them. So the secret was from the U.S. government, not just our fear of communists. So when I showed up on that ship, Secretary Schlesinger, when he got the message, he realized he had a big problem on his hands, because I had an unknown number of Vietnamese on my hands. And Do Kim and I had done this ourselves, and we're very proud of it. I am. I wish we'd have gotten 100,000 or 200,000. Now, the answer to your specific question, many of those people in re-education camps, friends of mine, who have subsequently come out, like 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, mostly depending on their rank. Enlisted men had 3 months, 4 months. Lieutenants, captains in the Army, they had 2 and 3 years, 4 or 5 years. And generals and admirals, they would have a long, long time. And some of them died. So I felt terrible about it, but I was relieved that most of them eventually got out of concentration camps, though they had a very difficult time. And their families had a difficult time.
What would you do differently?
You're just talking about the last week, right? Well, I think the obvious thing is, the reason Captain Kim and I thought we had 3 or 4 more days was because the intelligence, both South Vietnamese and the U.S., was saying that we had until the 4th of May, that the communists were not going to make a final push till the 4th of May. Unfortunately, that was what I was planning on, and I wish I'd have planned to go as soon as possible. But once things started to fall apart, although some of the South Vietnamese still fought valiantly, the weight of the North Vietnamese was so much, and it sped up the fall of the South. And we couldn't stop. I don't know if you remember the final days in Saigon, but all that last week, 122 millimeter rockets were falling through the city. On the 29th, the night I left, I had been from naval headquarters, Vietnamese Navy headquarters, to Tan Son Nhut 3 times. And each time had to go in a Jeep in a different direction because of fighting. And it was unbelievable. It was unbelievable.
The intelligence from the U.S. and also from Vietnam failed, or?
Yeah, of course it failed. It said we had 3 or 4 more days. And so I was going about my business, blowing things up, destroying equipment, and planning with Captain Kim to have this plan. And as I say, if we'd have had those 3 or 4 more days, I'm sure we'd have had 100,000 out. I hope.
And the outcome of Vietnam War, can you give us your thought on that?
Yeah. The proposition that a nation such as South Vietnam should be allowed to choose her own course is a valid one, and one that I endorse. Our strategy, however, failed. It wasn't because our military strategy failed. Vietnamese units that I worked with fought valiantly. American units never lost a major battle to the North Vietnamese, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter because we had a strategy of counterinsurgency. And a counterinsurgency strategy cannot be more successful or better than the government which it supports. And in this case, the government of Nguyen Van Thieu was not a good one. It was too corrupt, too interested in self-wealth, and not interested enough in the country's livelihood. So I'm very sorry we followed that strategy, because it failed.
Can you elaborate more on that?
Well, I mean, it's axiomatic that a counterinsurgency strategy, though you can kill a lot of enemy in the battlefield, you can't prevail because the government is not one that gets the support of the people. And we're having the same difficulty in Afghanistan right now. We have a counterinsurgency strategy. We have a very weak and corrupt government in Hamid Karzai's government. And so it's very difficult for me to understand how we can prevail in Afghanistan. In a very real way, I think Americans, after the French Indochina experience, misunderstood. We thought that since we were not a colonial power, we'd be seen as differently from the French. But in the minds of most Vietnamese, we were indeed, in another way, a colonial power. And it's too bad, at least for my country, because 58,000 servicemen are dead. It's too bad for Vietnam, as many as 3 million died.
Many of the soldiers said that they did not.
Pardon me?
Many of the soldiers did not have any bullets or anything to fight with.
In 1974, the U.S. Congress cut off the aid to Vietnam, and that made it a very difficult and dire situation. And so there was no more foreign aid coming into the South Vietnamese, and of course the North Vietnamese got the majority of their equipment from China, and they continued. So there was no question how this would end up. In the last days of Vietnam, There was a young colonel near Vung Tau by the name of Nguyen Yan Bia. And he had come with a plan that the women of Saigon and the South Vietnam should pool their jewelry and whatnot, and would use this for money to purchase weapons. But fact of the matter is, much of the money that had gone to Vietnam was plundered by government officials. So I personally do blame the U.S. Congress a lot for the cutoff of aid, but I also blame Vietnamese officials for corruption, misuse of funds. And so you're right, at the end of the day, soldiers were left without bullets.
So the strategy and the way it was handled, the U.S. and the government and the Vietnamese side were mishandled or
Well, I've said it. I don't know how I can say it better than I've already said it. Clearly, when our government, first of all, was involved in a way in the removal of Ngo Dinh Diem, and later supported the government of Nguyen Van Thieu, even though he was corrupt. His government was corrupt. So no matter how valiantly South Vietnamese fought and U.S. soldiers fought, and they did, they fought well. And North Vietnamese will tell you this. But we lost the battle on a political battlefield and not on an actual battlefield. So I'm very regretful of that, and I just wish that we'd learned the lesson from it.
What can we do differently, or what do you think?
Well, I think it's kind of you couldn't have done anything differently because Vietnam was when it was, and we were in the mindset we were in. And not right now, we've fallen into a similar, though much less bloody, trap in Afghanistan. Again, counting on counterinsurgency, which will fail because the government's so bad. So I think what we could do better is learn a little bit from history. And I think we'd have been better off. I volunteered to serve in Vietnam, and I served there 6 years. I volunteered to be an advisor because I didn't understand why it made any sense that American soldiers should carry rifles when there were plenty of young Vietnamese men who could carry rifles. But I did believe strongly that we should support Vietnam. We should support them with air power, with advisors who would share combat with them, with naval gunfire support. So I think the fact that we chose to take the place of many young Vietnamese men on the battlefield was a big mistake. In retrospect, a big mistake.
What do you think about Ngo Dinh Diem?
Ngo Dinh Diem? Ngo Dinh Diem, my view, was, along with Ho Chi Minh, two leaders who both had some charisma, had some following. Initially, in Ngo Dinh Diem's time, he was quite popular. And through his fighting with the Binh Xuyen, if you're familiar with that, and Cholon, etc., he was very popular. And he himself was a man who was, I think, not corrupt, but he was rigid, very rigid. And he never took charge of his brother or Madame Nhu. And they were the face or the image of his regime, so he became hated. But he was, I think, at one time he had the possibility of being a very good alternative as a charismatic leader to what was going on after the Geneva Accords in the North. But his rigidity, his inability to identify.
You, in early statement, you said that if America let the Vietnamese fight the battle and helping them with weapon aid and everything else.
And support from aircraft, naval gunfire support, and had advisors.
So the outcome of the war may be better, or we even won't know that. But we also heard that the reason American didn't stop the coup d'etat, let that happen because of Diem against to receive the troops from America, from America. That's
No,
why the,
no. Ngo Dinh Diem was killed, not because he wouldn't have troops from America. In fact, we didn't go in large numbers until 1965, several years after the death of Ngo Dinh Diem. What I was saying, and I believe, is that when we started taking large casualties, and we were taking, when you were in 68 and 69, I was there in 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, we were taking 300 dead Americans a week. And it doesn't take too long before public pressure builds up again in a democracy against that. If we had had fewer Americans there, but we had supported the South Vietnamese with the things they didn't have, aircraft, naval gunfire support, and advisors who could show them how to use the new weapons, etc., we'd have not had as much political pressure against us in this country. So that's just a simple fact. I cannot say with assurance that the government of South Vietnam would have been better. And that's the weak link. The government of South Vietnam, not the soldiers, not the naval personnel, who I thought were great.
But people say that Diem would better leader for Vietnam than the one that the one that killed him and got into the power.
Who, Ngo Dinh Diem? Yeah, for a time he was quite popular, and Americans thought he was terrific. In fact, in about 1955 or 56, John F. Kennedy, who was very skeptical about our support, U.S. support for the French in the French-Vietnam War, started crowing about the fact, or started taking great pride in the fact that Diem was the answer. For a time, it seemed that he was the answer. But over time, see, his government became very separated from the people. And as I say, his brother and his sister were the faces of the regime. And they became repressive on newspapers and things of that nature. They were way out of touch with the people, the normal people. And they were some, and not Ngo Dinh Diem, but some in that government were selling different posts, province chief, district chiefs, selling it. And then those district chiefs and province chiefs during the Diem era would falsify the list of how many soldiers were on in their base or in their district, so they'd get to pay for ghost soldiers. You've heard of this. Linh Ma.
But after the Diem, they do even more.
I know, it was worse.
They did worse.
There's also something, however, and I'm a Catholic. Ngo Dinh Diem was Catholic, famously so. This is one of the reasons, I think, when the Buddhist monks self-immolated and Madame Yu made her terrible comments about a barbecue, this showed a real separation from the majority of the citizens who more or less followed Buddhism from the Catholics, who in the main were from north, not completely, but from North Vietnam, who came south in 1954. So I think Ngo Dinh Diem started out beautifully, started out very well. But over time, he fell victim to his family, to his own rigidness, his lack of flexibility. He didn't want any advice from anyone, Vietnamese, American, or anyone.
So, talking about McNamara.
About whom?
McNamara?
McNamara? I cannot talk about him well, but I'll talk about him. I have nothing good to say about him.
Could you please give your opinion about his strategy and how he operated Vietnam War under your opinion?
The Robert McNamara, early on, as early as 1965, 66, thought the Vietnam War was unwinnable. And yet he kept at it. Kept supporting General William Westmoreland, and Westmoreland's call for more troops, when he knew better. And I find this unforgivable. So on his actions during the whole 10-year Vietnam War, during his part of it, I find very regrettable. And I hope he remembers it every time he shaves in the morning. But I don't have any strong views about Mr. McNamara.
I may want to bother you a little bit more. Can you go into more detail about that?
Have you interviewed him?
No.
Good luck.
I think he's dead, isn't he?
No, I think he's still alive. He may, if he died just in the last year or two.
I thought he passed away.
There's a very good book, a brand new book, called Embers of War. Embers of War. And it's basically a history that's unknown to most Vietnamese and Americans from about 1945 to about 1965, maybe a little longer than that. And it talks a lot about nudism. I haven't read it yet, but I'm going to. It was brought to my attention about a couple of days ago. And the reason the author wrote it is Mr. Obama just had declassified a lot of the papers that the U.S. government had kept secret for years. And now they're out. And it shows, for instance, that Dwight Eisenhower was much more involved in the Indochina conflict. And we were actually trying to keep the French fighting. And I mean, this is not known to the great majority of Americans, and I don't think it's known to the great majority of Vietnamese either.
We had a lot of photos yesterday.
Talking about supplying.
Pardon me?
It talked about how we were involved in supplying the French with.
Yeah, have you read it?
No.
Yeah.
This was yesterday in the archives. We found some.
He and me spent 2 days in the National Archive, and we found those footage.
Ah.
And it was like movie tone news type of stuff.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Really great. But they were talking. I mean, they had photos of artillery shells coming in that were made by the U.S. You know, we were really.
Well, the Eisenhower administration actually contemplated, they had a discussion about the use of tactical nuclear weapons to support the French. And the terrible thing is, from the U.S. point of view, in 1945, we were seen in all of Southeast Asia as heroic because we'd vanquished the Japanese. And then we turn around and we freed the Philippines again from our colonialism. So the United States in 1945, 46, 47 was viewed as number one, no question about it, because we were anti-colonial. We had freed the colonial hand of the Japanese off of Indochina. Even in North Vietnam, well, all of Vietnam, it was in the north. We were very well regarded. And then we started supporting the French, not realizing how this would be seen. And Eisenhower actually contemplated the use of tactical nuclear weapons to stop the North Vietnamese.
That's why non-communists, they have reason to, on their propaganda, they said that France left and left it to Americans. Americans come and invaded Vietnam.
Well, think of the song of Trinh Công Son. Sa tai của mẹ là nước Việt buồn. Huh? The Ho Yak Pháp. No Lay Tao. And the dominance of the United States, 20 years of that. So.
And so Vietnam, and I think that.
Is Con Lee still alive?
Yes, she's still alive.
Does she still sing?
She's still singing. Yes, she's still singing. Wow, you know all that.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay, continue. So.
In the American history books, it says that the U.S. invasion of Vietnam.
U.S. invasion?
Invaded Vietnam. U.S. invaded Vietnam in the.
Well, that's not historically accurate. That's not historically accurate. In which book is that?
It's in the American history text
Yeah, in teaching
that
11th
were
grade.
taught in high school.
That's not historically true. I think the United States made a lot of mistakes in Vietnam. And as we already discussed, I wish I'd have done some things differently, but I'm not ashamed of my service. We didn't invade. The Vietnamese who fought alongside me, I'm very proud of them. I was very proud to be with them. Hardly an invasion.
But they also went on to say that Ho Chi Minh was the father of their country and reunited.
Actually, Ho Chi Minh had more trouble than you'd know. Lê Duẩn was the real power. And Ho Chi Minh had to keep jumping around in front of him. It really was interesting.
When you know about Ho Chi Minh, can you tell us? Do you know
What I know about Ho Chi Minh? I know the day he died, on his birthday, which is in May. 19th, I knew it was in May. I couldn't remember the day, but I got a message at my base and said, your counterpart, Vietnamese counterpart, will be getting the same message. Said today is Bác Ho's birthday, so light many candles for him. So that meant we were to go out and try to engage the enemy in a fight. I remember that very well.
your feelings on over in Vietnam? They said that he's the father.
On his what?
They said he's the father of Vietnam.
Some textbooks, especially in elementary, they have a clause like this. Ho Chi Minh was the father of the
country.
Vietnam,
Yeah.
who brought independence, happiness, and freedom to Vietnam. And it troubled us. And we would like to have your opinion about your thoughts on that.
The saying in the South, when I served in Vietnam, was also a saying in the North, and that is, "Không có gì quý hơn tự do và độc lập." That's true in the South, and it was true in the North. They both said it. Unfortunately, Ho Chi Minh, Lê Duẩn, General Yap, others had reputations as being nationalist, which they were, of fighting against colonialism, which they did. None of the Southern leaders had that. As I say, Ngo Dinh Diem had the most charisma. He was a nationalist, nobody doubted that. But other than Ngo Dinh Diem, there was no one else who had those kind of credentials. At the end of the Indochina War of 1954, the troops in the north of Vo Nguyen Giap were demoralized, were weak, they were tired, they were discouraged. Even though they'd won, they'd beat the French. And it took several years for Ho Chi Minh and General Giap and others to help the soldiers in the north to regain their morale, et cetera, et cetera. And they did it because of their own they were able to do it because of their nationalist credentials.
So, Ho Chi Minh and Giap and others, they also kill a lot of Vietnamese. So that's why all the leaders were killed like that.
As I say, or either killed them or had them turned over to authorities, sometimes to the French, just to get them out of the way.
That's why when, North and South Vietnam divided, South Vietnam didn't have much of a leader anymore. Because they were killed by Ho Chi Minh.
Many. But in 1954, South Vietnam received about 1 million, mainly Catholic, not entirely, but mainly Catholic former citizens of North Vietnam, which greatly enriched the intellectual abilities of the South. Because these families who came were primarily educated, upper middle class, etc. So in a way, South lost a lot of their leadership through the nefarious schemes of communists. They also gained, after the Geneva Accords of 1954, an interesting new population from the north.
Back to the Vietnam.
Yeah.
Some of the Vietnamese that you had helped became Vietnamese American over here, and of course we still have many difficulties but we also contributed a lot, very significantly to this country. Can you give us your comment?
Well, as I said earlier, I sponsored, my wife and I and our family sponsored over 30 Vietnamese whom I had known in Vietnam and their families. And they're all out working, they all got jobs. Took a while, there was a struggle. But about 20 years after the fall of Saigon, as I'd read graduation lists from high schools and whatnot, then very often the names of the top 1 and 2 in the class were Vietnamese because of the high value that Vietnamese families put on education. This filled me with a great deal of enthusiasm. We've had a Vietnamese American congressman from Louisiana, Mr. Cao, I think his name. We've got in the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army, and the Marine Corps, Vietnamese officers, not just enlisted men, but officers who are commanding other Americans, and we're very much enthusiastic about that. You go in the U.S. government now, and there are even organizations of young Vietnamese Americans who are doing quite well. You know, when back during the war, my Vietnamese counterparts used to tell me, you know, you should never underestimate the abilities of Vietnamese people. I said, I don't underestimate it. He said, no, you must never underestimate the ability of a single Vietnamese. I said, what do you mean? They would explain it, look, if you have a Vietnamese and he's in a competition with a Japanese or Korean or Chinese, we will win every time. He said, however, if you have 3 Vietnamese who are in a competition with 3 Japanese, we will lose by a long way to the Japanese. And I said, why do you say that? He said, well, because if you have 3 Vietnamese, you're going to have 4 different ideas. And if you have 3 Japanese, you'll have 1 idea, and they'll go to it. I've never forgotten it.
That's true.
That is very
It's true to some extent.
Do you have anything else to share?
Talk all day, but I don't know how to say very much.
What did you have lost in Vietnam?
Pardon me?
I said that you lost your hearing. What else did you lose in Vietnam?
As a civilian in 1974, I worked for something called the Defense Attaché Office. And because of the Paris ceasefire, the U.S. was forbidden to have more than 50 uniformed officers. So I simply took off my uniform, got out of the service, and I was the senior advisor to the Vietnamese Marine Corps, Truy Con Op Chin, Hải quân. And one of my jobs was every 2 weeks to take ammunition and rice from Saigon up the river to Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And every time we went up there, we got shot terribly. And so I had almost 6 years in Vietnam, in many battles, never hit. But as a civilian, I got hit. I lost this ear, I got shrapnel up and down my arm, so I lost skin, I got a hole in my leg. But some great irony, to have all that time on a battlefield and be fine, and as a civilian, to get wounded.
So how long was your involvement with the Vietnam all total?
We're 6 years, almost 6 years.
Almost 6 years as a serviceman and
4 years as a serviceman, 2 as a civilian. And my government has sent me back to Vietnam 3 times, in 1982, 84, and 86, and I went.
What were your missions?
Prisoners of war and missing in action. So I went to Hanoi and talked to Nguyen Ca Thach and his colleagues.
was that mission accomplished?
Oh, over time it was. We had thousands of missing, and over time, with a lot of patience, working with the North Vietnamese authorities, we were able to have returned several thousand bodies. There were no live Americans, apparently, but bodies. And this is some comfort to the American families. They at least know the answer. Their loved one's dead. So was it successful? Not immediately. Was it successful over time? Yes.
Is it difficult to deal with the communists in order to get...
I wouldn't say it was difficult. They were interested in 1982 because even in one of the bases I served at, we found out later, that was in Tay Ninh, and a second-class petty officer, what you'd call it, Trung Sĩ, he was a North Vietnamese spy. And so everything the Americans did, he was reporting on. So they knew a lot about me when I went to Vietnam. And they knew where I'd served and who my friends were, the Vietnamese friends, and how I'd done and what battles I'd fought. So initially they were kind of interested. And they wanted to talk to me a little bit, but they were kind of grumpy. By 84 and 86, they were a lot better.
During the Vietnam War, there are a lot of anti-war
In North Vietnam?
in the U.S.
Since then?
No.
During it, yeah, sure, yeah. Well, I'm sure you had the same experience I had. I'd come home from leave and be treated terribly by anti-war. I mean, terribly. My wife was harassed. My children were harassed at her school, at their school.
Because you went to Vietnam?
Yes.
Yes.
I heard that people spit on Vietnam
Some people.
veterans.
Now they would, but as I say, we lost the war politically. And we lost it in the halls of the meeting rooms in Paris when we were having the Kissinger late October negotiations. And we lost it here, particularly after the invasion of Cambodia in 1970.
Was there anything due to the media
Was there anything what?
with the anti-war, anti-Vietnam War? Was it due to the media also, do you think? The U.S. media?
Oh, sure. But in a free society, you can't let the opposition dominate the media. And Mr. Nixon became involved, in the Watergate, et cetera, daily became weaker and weaker and weaker, and it was very difficult to counter the opposition media's cries about us. And it was an awful lot of effort by the North Vietnamese to propagate false stories, et cetera, here in the U.S. media. So yeah, it played a huge role. But the weakness of President Nixon here because of Watergate and other things also played a huge role.
So Vietnam War was not the only problem that the U.S. had during that.
No. In fact, Mr. Nixon was getting us out. But he would have preferred to have a way to support Vietnam and not have funds cut off. Come and enrich the educational fabric of our country. And we ask one thing in return, and that is to accept our national values. And as far as I can see, the great majority of Vietnamese Americans have done just that. And so I'm very proud.
Thank you very much for your time.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you. Thank you. Do young Vietnamese still read Kim Van Q?
Yes,
Do they?
only in the Vietnamese class.
But
In the classroom, usually the community have the Vietnamese language
Yes.
in the weekend. So we